Welcome to Part 6, the finale of Pride and Prejudice, Reimagined. We are finishing the classic book as reimagined it in the style of best-selling romance author Carolyn Brown. If you enjoy this content, please take a minute to like, subscribe, or share this video. You can also hit the bell to be notified of new classic books reimagined as soon as they are published here on YouTube. If there is a classic book you would like to hear reimagined in the style of a modern author, please leave it in the comments.
Chapter 51, The Wedding Day. The day of Lydia's wedding dawned bright and clear, and the Bennet household buzzed with a mix of excitement and dread. Jane and Elizabeth, their hearts heavy with a blend of worry and hope, anticipated their sister's return more anxiously than Lydia herself. The carriage had been sent to fetch the newlyweds from the nearby town, and they were expected back by dinner time. Jane, in particular, felt a deep unease, empathizing with Lydia's predicament as if it were her own. As the clock ticked closer to their arrival, the family gathered in the cosy breakfast room. Mrs. Bennet, unable to hide her glee, flitted about with a radiant smile. Mr. Bennet, on the other hand, sat with an impenetrably grave expression. Jane and Elizabeth exchanged worried glances while Mary and Kitty hovered nearby, unsure of what to expect. From the vestibule, Lydia's cheerful voice echoed, and moments later, the door swung open. Lydia burst into the room, her face glowing with unrestrained joy. She ran to her mother, who embraced her with exuberant delight. Mrs. Bennet then turned to greet Wickham, extending her hand with a welcoming smile, and wishing them both joy, with a genuine enthusiasm that left no room for doubt about her happiness. Mr. Bennet's reception was notably less warm. His stern expression deepened, and he barely acknowledged the couple. The carefree assurance with which Lydia and Wickham carried themselves was enough to provoke his silent disapproval. Elizabeth, standing beside Jane, felt a wave of disgust wash over her, while Jane looked on, dismayed by Lydia's unabashed behaviour. Lydia was, as ever, a whirlwind of energy, untamed, noisy, and utterly fearless. She flitted from sister to sister, demanding their congratulations and laughing about how long it had been since she'd last been home. Wickham, ever charming, chatted amiably with everyone, his easy manners almost making one forget his flaws. Elizabeth, however, sat resolute, determined not to be swayed by his charm. The conversation flowed freely, with Mrs. Bennet and Lydia leading the charge, talking faster than anyone could keep up. Wickham, seated near Elizabeth, inquired about acquaintances in the neighbourhood with such good-natured ease that Elizabeth struggled to maintain her composure. It was as if the past 3 months had erased all memories of pain and conflict, and Lydia eagerly brought up subjects that her sisters would have preferred to avoid. "Can you believe it's been 3 months since I left?" Lydia exclaimed. "It feels like only a fortnight. So much has happened. When I went away, I had no idea I'd come back married. Though, to be honest, I thought it would be quite fun if I did." Her father lifted his eyes to the ceiling in exasperation, while Jane winced, and Elizabeth shot Lydia a meaningful look. But Lydia, ever oblivious, continued cheerfully, "Oh, Mama, do the neighbours know I'm married? I was worried they might not, so when we overtook William Goulding in his curricle, I made sure he saw my ring. I let down the window, waved my hand, and smiled broadly." Unable to bear it any longer, Elizabeth stood abruptly and left the room. She stayed away until she heard them moving towards the dining parlour, then joined them just in time to see Lydia confidently take her place beside their mother. Lydia turned to Jane and said, "Ah, Jane, I take your place now. You must sit lower because I am a married woman." It was clear that time had only increased Lydia's confidence and cheer. She eagerly anticipated visiting Mrs. Phillips, the Lucases, and all their neighbours, thrilled at the prospect of being called Mrs. Wickham by everyone. After dinner, she proudly displayed her ring to Mrs. Hill and the housemaids, boasting about her new status. "Well, Mamma," Lydia said, returning to the breakfast room, "what do you think of my husband? Isn't he charming? I'm sure my sisters must be envious. I hope they have half my luck. They must all go to Brighton. That's the place to find husbands. It's such a pity we didn't all go." Mrs. Bennet sighed. "Very true, and if I had my way, we would have. But, my dear Lydia, I don't like you being so far away. Must it be so?" "Oh, Lord, yes, there's nothing to it. I'll love it. You, Papa, and my sisters must come visit. We'll be in Newcastle all winter, and I'm sure there will be balls. I'll make sure to find good partners for everyone." "That sounds wonderful," Mrs. Bennet exclaimed. "When we leave, you can keep 1 or 2 of your sisters. I'm sure you'll find them husbands before winter ends." Elizabeth interjected, "Thank you, but I don't particularly like your method of finding husbands." Their visit would last only 10 days, as Wickham was to join his regiment soon. No one but Mrs. Bennet regretted their short stay. She made the most of it by hosting frequent parties, which everyone appreciated as a welcome distraction from the awkward family dynamics. Wickham's affection for Lydia was just as Elizabeth had expected, superficial and far from equal to Lydia's adoration. Lydia, blinded by her love, saw no fault in him and praised him endlessly. He was her dear Wickham in all things, and she was certain he would excel in everything. One morning, while sitting with her sisters, Lydia turned to Elizabeth and said, "Lizzie, I don't think I ever told you about my wedding. You weren't there when I told Mama and the others. Aren't you curious?" "No, not really," Elizabeth replied. "I think the less said about it, the better." "Oh, you're so strange. But I must tell you. We were married at St. Clement's because Wickham's lodgings were in that parish. We were to be there by 11. My uncle, aunt and I went together, and the others were to meet us at the church. Well, Monday morning came and I was in such a fuss. I was so afraid something would happen to delay it. My aunt kept preaching and talking as I dressed, but I didn't hear half of it. I was thinking about my dear Wickham. I wondered if he would wear his blue coat. We had breakfast at 10, but it seemed to last forever. My uncle and aunt were horridly unpleasant the whole time I was with them. Can you believe I didn't go out once, though I was there a fortnight? Not one party or scheme. London was rather quiet, but the little theatre was open. Just as the carriage arrived, my uncle was called away on business. I was so frightened, thinking we'd miss the hour and not be able to marry. But he returned in 10 minutes and we set off. I realised later that if he hadn't made it, Mr. Darcy could have given me away. "Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth exclaimed in amazement. "Oh, yes! He was to come with Wickham, but I wasn't supposed to say that. It was a secret. What will Wickham say? I promised I wouldn't tell." Jane intervened. "If it was a secret, Lydia, you should say no more. We won't ask further." Elizabeth added, "Indeed, we will not ask any more questions." "Thank you," Lydia said, "for if you did, I'd tell you everything, and Wickham would be furious." To avoid further temptation, Elizabeth left the room, but her curiosity was piqued. Why was Mr. Darcy at Lydia's wedding? It made no sense. She quickly penned a letter to her aunt, seeking an explanation. "You can imagine my curiosity," she wrote, "to know why Mr. Darcy, unconnected with us, was there. Please explain, unless it must remain a secret." She added a postscript to herself, "Not that I will be satisfied with ignorance." Jane's sense of propriety prevented her from discussing Lydia's slip with Elizabeth, who was grateful for the discretion. Until she received a reply, Elizabeth preferred to ponder the mystery alone. Chapter 52. A surprise letter and a secret revealed. Elizabeth's heart leaped when she finally received a letter from her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner. Eager to read it in peace, she hurried into the small, cosy copse at the edge of Longbourn's garden. Sitting down on a weathered wooden bench, she took a deep breath and opened the letter, ready for the wave of emotions that she knew would follow. Gracechurch Street, September 6th. My dear niece, I have just received your letter, and shall devote this whole morning to answering it, as I foresee that a little writing will not suffice for what I have to tell you. I must confess myself surprised by your inquiries. I did not expect them from you. Don't think me angry, however. I only mean to let you know that I had not imagined such questions would come from your side. If you do not choose to understand me, forgive my impertinence. Your uncle is as much surprised as I am. Nothing but the belief of your being a party concerned would have allowed him to act as he has done. But if you are really innocent and ignorant, I must be more explicit. On the very day of my coming home from Longbourn, your uncle had a most unexpected visitor. Mr. Darcy called and was with him for several hours. It was all over before I arrived, so my curiosity was not so dreadfully racked as yours seems to have been. He came to tell Mr. Gardiner that he had found your sister and Mr. Wickham, and that he had seen and talked with them both. Wickham repeatedly, Lydia once. From what I can gather, he left Derbyshire only one day after ourselves and came to town with the resolution of finding them. The motive he professed was his conviction that it was due to his own silence, that Wickham's worthlessness was not known, making it possible for any young woman to love or trust him. He generously took the blame on himself, admitting his pride had led him to believe it beneath him to reveal private matters. His sense of duty led him to rectify the situation. If he had another motive, I am sure it would never disgrace him. He was in town for several days before finding them, guided by information from a Mrs. Junge, who had once been Miss Darcy's governess. She had been dismissed for some misconduct and now maintained herself by letting lodgings. Mr. Darcy knew she was acquainted with Wickham and sought her out. After some days, and likely a bribe, she gave him the needed information. They were in Street. Mr. Darcy saw Wickham and then insisted on seeing Lydia. His first objective was to persuade her to leave her current situation and return to her family, offering his assistance. But Lydia was resolved to stay. She was certain they would marry eventually. Wickham, however, had never intended to marry her. He admitted he had to leave the regiment due to pressing debts and had hoped to make his fortune by marriage elsewhere. Mr. Darcy met Wickham several times, eventually persuading him to marry Lydia. They arranged everything, with Mr. Darcy ensuring all debts were settled and Wickham's commission purchased. He then informed your uncle of the plans. Your father, being with Mr. Gardiner, was not consulted, as Mr. Darcy thought your uncle more suitable for the task. The news settled, Mr. Darcy returned to Pemberley, but agreed to return to London for the wedding. It is clear, my dear Lizzie, that Mr. Darcy did this out of a sense of duty and perhaps a lingering partiality for you. He took on the entire burden himself, not allowing your uncle to bear any cost or responsibility. Yours very sincerely, Monsieur Gardiner. Elizabeth's heart fluttered as she read and reread the letter. The realization that Mr. Darcy had taken on so much for her family, out of both duty and affection, was overwhelming. She felt a deep sense of gratitude and admiration for him, mingled with regret for how she had judged him in the past. As she was lost in thought, she heard footsteps approaching. Before she could react, she saw Wickham coming towards her. "Am I interrupting your solitude, dear sister?" he asked with a smile. "You certainly are," she replied, forcing a smile, "but it doesn't mean the interruption is unwelcome." "I should hope not. We were always good friends, and now we are better." "True. Are the others joining us?" "No, Mrs. Bennet and Lydia are off to Meryton. So, I hear you've seen Pemberley?" "Yes, I have," she said, bracing herself for his usual charm. "I almost envy you the pleasure. Did you meet the housekeeper? She was always very fond of me. I bet she had nothing but good things to say about me." "Actually, she did mention you," Elizabeth said calmly. "She was concerned you had not turned out well." Wickham's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Misunderstandings, I assure you. By the way, did you see Darcy in town?" "Yes, we crossed paths. Perhaps he was preparing for his marriage to Miss de Bourgh," Elizabeth suggested lightly. "Ah, yes, possibly. Did you meet his sister?" "Yes, and I liked her very much. She's improved, I've heard. When I last saw her, she was not very promising." "Did you visit Kympton?" "I don't recall." "It's the living I was to have. Perfect place, delightful parsonage house. It would have suited me in every way." "How would you have liked making sermons?" Elizabeth asked, trying to suppress a smile. "Quite well. It would have been a duty I'd soon grow accustomed to. A quiet life would have suited me. They reached the house, and Elizabeth, wanting to end the conversation, said with a good-humoured smile, "Come, Mr. Wickham, we are now brother and sister. Let's not quarrel about the past. In the future, let's hope we are always of one mind." Wickham took her hand and kissed it gallantly. They entered the house, leaving Elizabeth to her swirling thoughts of Darcy and the future. This unexpected turn of events left Elizabeth both humbled and proud. She understood Darcy's actions now, and her heart swelled with newfound admiration for him. As she pondered the possibilities, the bond of family and the promise of love filled her with a sense of hope and warmth, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Chapter 53. Parting Ways and New Beginnings. Mr. Wickham was so thoroughly satisfied with the conversation he had with Elizabeth that he never again brought up the subject, much to her relief. Elizabeth was pleased to see that she had managed to keep him at bay. The day of Lydia and Wickham's departure arrived soon enough, and Mrs. Bennet had to face the fact that, given Mr. Bennet's staunch refusal to move the entire family to Newcastle, it would be at least a year before she saw her youngest daughter again. "Oh, my dear Lydia," Mrs. Bennet cried, her voice trembling with emotion, "when shall we meet again?" Lydia, ever the carefree spirit, replied, "Oh, Lord, I don't know, not for 2 or 3 years, perhaps." "Write to me very often, my dear," her mother implored. "As often as I can, but you know married women never have much time for writing. My sisters can write to me, they'll have nothing else to do." Mr. Wickham's farewell was far more affectionate than his wife's. With a charming smile, he looked every bit the dashing husband and uttered many sweet nothings that seemed to please Mrs. Bennet immensely. "He is as fine a fellow as I ever saw," Mr. Bennet remarked dryly as soon as they left. "He simpers and smirks and makes love to us all. I am prodigiously proud of him. I defy even Sir William Lucas himself to produce a more valuable son-in-law." Mrs. Bennet felt quite forlorn for several days. "I often think," she sighed, "that there is nothing as bad as parting with one's friends. One feels so desolate without them." "This is the consequence, you see, madam, of marrying a daughter," Elizabeth teased gently. "It must make you better satisfied that your other 4 are single." "It is no such thing. Lydia does not leave me because she is married, but only because her husband's regiment happens to be so far off. If it were closer, she would not have gone so soon." But Mrs. Bennet's spirits were soon revived by an exciting piece of news circulating through Meryton. The housekeeper at Netherfield had received orders to prepare for the arrival of Mr. Bingley, who was coming down to shoot for several weeks. Mrs. Bennet, her eyes sparkling, shared the news with Jane and Elizabeth. "Well, well, and so Mr. Bingley is coming down, sister," said Mrs. Phillips, who first brought the news. "Not that I care about it, though. He is nothing to us, you know, and I am sure I never want to see him again. But however, he is very welcome to come to Netherfield if he likes it, and who knows what may happen. But that is nothing to us. You know, sister, we agreed long ago never to mention a word about it. And so it is quite certain he is coming." "You may depend on it," Mrs. Phillips replied, "for Mrs. Nichols was in Meryton last night and told me herself. He is coming down on Thursday at the latest." Jane had not heard Mr. Bingley's name mentioned for months, and the news brought a flush to her cheeks. As soon as she and Elizabeth were alone, she confessed, "I saw you look at me today, Lizzie, when Aunt Phillips mentioned Mr. Bingley's arrival. I know I seemed distressed, but it was only because I felt everyone would be looking at me. The news does not affect me with pleasure or pain. I am glad he comes alone. We shall see less of him. I am not afraid for myself, but I dread other people's remarks." Elizabeth didn't know what to make of it. Had she not seen him in Derbyshire, she might have believed he came with no other intent than to shoot, but she still thought him partial to Jane. She wondered if he had his friend's permission or had come of his own accord. In spite of Jane's calm assurances, Elizabeth could see her sister's spirits were more unsettled than usual. As Mr. Bingley's arrival drew near, the subject was once again brought up between their parents. "As soon as Mr. Bingley comes, my dear, you will wait on him, of course," Mrs. Bennet said to her husband. "No, no, you forced me into visiting him last year, and it ended in nothing. I will not be sent on a fool's errand again." Mrs. Bennet insisted. "It is an etiquette I despise," said he. "If he wants our society, let him seek it. He knows where we live." "Well, all I know is it will be abominably rude if you do not wait on him. But however, that shan't prevent my asking him to dine here. We must have Mrs. Long and the Gouldings soon. That will make 13 with ourselves, so there will be just room at the table for him." Consoled by her plan, Mrs. Bennet could better bear her husband's incivility, though it was mortifying to know their neighbours might see Mr. Bingley before they did. As the day of his arrival approached, Jane confided in Elizabeth. "I begin to be sorry that he comes at all. It would be nothing. I could see him with perfect indifference, but I can hardly bear to hear it thus perpetually talked of. My mother means well, but no one can know how much I suffer from what she says." Elizabeth wished she could comfort her sister, but all she could do was listen. Mr. Bingley arrived, and Mrs. Bennet, always keen for news, was the first to spot him riding into the paddock with a companion. "There is a gentleman with him," said Kitty. "Who can it be?" "Some acquaintance or other, my dear, I suppose," replied Mrs. Bennet. "It looks just like that tall, proud man that used to be with him before. Mr. What's-his-name? Mr. Darcy." Elizabeth's heart raced. How could it be? She exchanged a glance with Jane, both feeling the awkwardness of the situation. Elizabeth had never told Jane about Mr. Darcy's letter or her change of heart. When the gentlemen were shown into the room, Jane and Elizabeth tried to maintain their composure. Elizabeth barely glanced at Mr. Darcy, though she felt his presence keenly. His usual seriousness seemed even more pronounced, and she couldn't help but compare his demeanour now with his more relaxed manner in Derbyshire. Mrs. Bennet's enthusiasm was unabated, inviting Mr. Bingley to dine with them soon. "You are quite a visit in my debt, Mr. Bingley," she said. "You promised to take a family dinner with us as soon as you returned. I was very much disappointed when you did not keep your engagement." Bingley, looking a little embarrassed, made polite excuses. Elizabeth cringed at her mother's eagerness, but was relieved when they finally left. As they departed, Mrs. Bennet exclaimed, "What a delightful thing it is to have a daughter well married." Elizabeth, feeling the weight of her mother's inappropriate joy, could only sigh inwardly. The complexities of love, family, and propriety swirled around her, leaving her to wonder how everything would eventually resolve. Chapter 54. A Dance of Hearts and Hope. As soon as the guests had left, Elizabeth slipped outside to clear her mind and gather her thoughts. The crisp evening air was a balm, but it couldn't dispel the confusion and vexation swirling inside her. Mr. Darcy's behaviour had left her flustered. "Why did he come if he was only going to be silent and distant?" she muttered to herself, pacing along the garden path. "If he cared for me, why not show it? And if he doesn't, why come at all? Teasing, confusing man." Her musings were interrupted by Jane's arrival, her sister's face alight with a rare cheerfulness. "Now that this first meeting is over, I feel perfectly at ease," Jane said, her eyes twinkling. "I know my own strength, and I shall never be embarrassed again by his coming. I'm glad he dines here on Tuesday. It will be publicly seen that we meet only as common and indifferent acquaintances." Elizabeth laughed lightly. "Oh, Jane, take care. You might make him fall in love with you all over again." "My dear Lizzie, you cannot think me so weak as to be in danger now." "I think you're in great danger of making him as smitten as ever." Tuesday came quickly, and with it a grand dinner party at Longbourn. Mrs. Bennet was in high spirits, bustling about with the excitement of a young girl preparing for her first ball. The guests arrived on time, and Elizabeth watched with bated breath as Bingley hesitated upon entering the dining room. Her heart soared when he chose to sit by Jane, whose smile had sealed the decision. Elizabeth couldn't help but glance towards Mr. Darcy. He bore the scene with a composed indifference that both puzzled and frustrated her. Still, there was a glimmer of amusement in his eyes as he looked at Bingley, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps this time things might go right. Throughout dinner, Bingley's admiration for Jane was evident, though he was more guarded than before. Elizabeth found a flicker of hope in his attentiveness. However, Mr. Darcy, seated far across the table, next to Mrs. Bennet, appeared solemn and distant. Elizabeth's heart ached at their enforced separation and her mother's coolness towards him, which made her more aware of the kindness he had shown their family. The evening wore on with Elizabeth, growing more anxious. She yearned for a moment alone with Mr. Darcy to exchange more than just polite greetings. She was ready to give up all hope if he did not approach her. When the gentleman finally joined them in the drawing-room, she felt a surge of anticipation. But the ladies had crowded around the tea table, leaving no space for Mr. Darcy to sit near her. One of the younger girls even whispered to Elizabeth, "The men shan't come and part us. I am determined." Elizabeth watched helplessly as Mr. Darcy walked to another part of the room. Her heart sank, and she scolded herself for hoping he might still have feelings for her. Yet, her spirits lifted slightly when he brought his coffee cup to her, and she seized the chance to speak to him. "Is your sister still at Pemberley?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "She will remain there until Christmas." "And is she alone? Have all her friends left?" "Mrs. Annesley is with her. The others have gone to Scarborough these 3 weeks." Elizabeth wanted to say more, but words failed her. Mr. Darcy stood by her for a few minutes in silence before walking away. She felt a pang of regret, wishing she had been braver. When the tea things were cleared away and the card tables set, Elizabeth hoped Mr. Darcy might join her. But Mrs. Bennet's insistence on him playing whist dashed her hopes. They spent the rest of the evening at separate tables, exchanging only occasional glances. As the evening ended and the guests departed, Mrs. Bennet was full of praises. "Well, girls, everything has passed off uncommonly well. The dinner was splendid, and even Mr. Darcy complimented the partridges. And Jane, my dear, you looked absolutely beautiful. Mrs. Long agreed, saying we shall have you at Netherfield at last." Elizabeth and Jane shared a private smile. Jane said, "It has been a very agreeable day, Lizzie. The party was well selected. I hope we may often meet again." Elizabeth replied with a knowing smile, "Jane, you mustn't suspect me. I am happy that you enjoy his company." "Don't worry, Lizzie. I assure you I have learned to enjoy his conversation without wishing for anything more." "You are very cruel," Elizabeth teased. "You won't let me smile, yet you provoke me to it every moment." Jane laughed softly. "Some things are hard to believe, and some are impossible. But why try to convince me that I feel more than I acknowledge?" Elizabeth hugged her sister, feeling the warmth of family and the stirrings of hope. "Because, Jane, we all love to teach, even if it's only what's not worth knowing." The evening had been a mixture of highs and lows, but Elizabeth felt a flicker of hope for Jane and Bingley. And as for Mr. Darcy, the future held possibilities she dared not yet name. Chapter 55. An Unexpected Proposal. A few days after his last visit, Mr. Bingley called again, this time alone. His friend, Mr. Darcy, had left for London that morning, but was expected to return in 10 days. Mr. Bingley spent over an hour with the Bennet family, his spirits high and his demeanour charming. Mrs. Bennet, with her usual enthusiasm, invited him to dine with them, but he regretfully declined, citing a prior engagement. "Next time you call," she said, "I hope we shall be more lucky." He assured her he would be particularly happy to visit them at any time and, with her permission, would come as soon as he could. "Can you come tomorrow?" she asked eagerly. "Yes, I have no engagement for tomorrow," he replied with a smile, accepting her invitation with alacrity. He arrived the next day earlier than expected, catching the ladies still in their dressing gowns. Mrs. Bennet, in her own dressing gown, with her hair half done, burst into her daughter's room. My dear Jane, make haste and hurry down. He is come. Mr. Bingley is come. He is indeed. Make haste, make haste. Sarah, help Miss Bennet with her gown. Never mind Miss Lizzie's hair. We will be down as soon as we can, Jane assured her. But I dare say Kitty is more ready than either of us. She went upstairs half an hour ago. Oh, hang Kitty! What has she to do with it? Come, be quick, be quick! Where is your sash, my dear? Once her mother had gone, Jane insisted on waiting for one of her sisters before going downstairs. The same anxiety to have Jane and Bingley alone was evident that evening. After tea, Mr. Bennet retired to the library, and Mary went upstairs to her instrument. Mrs. Bennet looked and winked at Elizabeth and Kitty for a considerable time, but neither took the hint. "What is the matter, mamma?" Kitty asked innocently. "What do you keep winking at me for? What am I to do?" "Nothing, child, nothing. I did not wink at you." After 5 more minutes of silence, she abruptly stood up. "Come here, my love. I want to speak to you," she said, taking Kitty out of the room. Jane glanced at Elizabeth, her eyes pleading for her not to leave her alone. Moments later, Mrs. Bennet half opened the door and called out, "Lizzie, my dear, I want to speak with you." Elizabeth had no choice but to go. "We may as well leave them by themselves," her mother said as soon as they were in the hall. "Kitty and I are going upstairs to my dressing room." Elizabeth made no attempt to argue, and quietly waited until they were out of sight before returning to the drawing room. Despite Mrs. Bennet's efforts, Mr. Bingley was nothing but charming, though he made no overt declaration of his feelings for Jane. He accepted an invitation to shoot with Mr. Bennet the next morning and returned to Longbourn for dinner, where Mrs. Bennet's attempts to orchestrate alone time for Jane and Bingley continued. Elizabeth, having a letter to write, excused herself to the breakfast room. When she returned, she found Jane and Bingley standing together by the hearth, their faces a mix of surprise and delight as they quickly moved apart. Their awkwardness confirmed Elizabeth's suspicions, and she was about to leave when Bingley whispered something to Jane and quickly left the room. Jane, unable to contain her joy, embraced Elizabeth. "I am the happiest creature in the world," she exclaimed. "'Tis too much. I do not deserve it. Oh, why is not everybody as happy?" Elizabeth's heartfelt congratulations brought fresh waves of happiness to Jane. "I must go to my mother," Jane said, her face glowing with joy. "He is already speaking to my father. Oh, Lizzie, to know that what I have to tell will bring such pleasure to our family. How shall I bear so much happiness?" Jane hurried to find Mrs. Bennet, who had broken up the card party and was sitting upstairs with Kitty. Elizabeth smiled, reflecting on how quickly and easily the matter had been resolved after so many months of uncertainty. And this, she thought, is the end of all his friends' anxious circumspection, the happiest, wisest, and most reasonable end. Bingley soon returned, having concluded his conversation with Mr. Bennet. "Where is your sister?" he asked hastily. "With my mother upstairs. She will be down in a moment, I dare say." He then shut the door and approached Elizabeth, seeking her good wishes and affection as a sister. Elizabeth warmly expressed her delight at the prospect of their new relationship. They shook hands cordially, and until Jane came down, Elizabeth listened to Bingley's rapturous declarations of happiness and praise for Jane. The evening was one of unparalleled delight for the entire Bennet family. Jane's happiness was evident in her radiant face, and even Kitty simpered and smiled, hoping her turn for such joy would come soon. Mrs. Bennet could not speak warmly enough of Bingley, praising him for half an hour. When Mr. Bennet joined them at supper, his happiness was evident, though he said nothing until their guest had left. "Jane, I congratulate you. You will be a very happy woman," he said, as soon as Bingley departed. Jane kissed her father, thanking him for his goodness. "You are a good girl," he replied, "and I have great pleasure in thinking you will be happily settled. I have no doubt you will do very well together." Mrs. Bennet, overjoyed, exclaimed, "Oh, my dear, dear Jane, I am so happy. I am sure I shan't get a wink of sleep all night. I knew it would be so. I always said it must be. You are so beautiful. He is the handsomest young man that ever was seen." Wickham and Lydia were forgotten in the excitement. Jane was now the favourite child, and her younger sisters quickly made requests for future favours. Mary asking for the use of the library at Netherfield, and Kitty begging for winter balls there. Bingley became a daily visitor at Longbourn, often arriving before breakfast and staying until after supper, unless some neighbour's invitation forced him away. Elizabeth had little time to speak with Jane when Bingley was present, but found herself useful in their brief moments apart, providing a willing ear for both. One evening, Jane shared, "He made me so happy by telling me he was completely ignorant of my being in town last spring. I had not believed it possible." "I suspected as much," Elizabeth replied. "But how did he account for it?" "It must have been his sisters. They were no friends to his acquaintance with me. But when they see that he is happy, they will learn to be contented." "That is the most unforgiving speech I have ever heard you utter," Elizabeth teased. "Good girl. It would vex me to see you again, the dupe of Miss Bingley's pretended regard." "Would you believe that when he went to town last November, he really loved me? Nothing but the belief that I was indifferent kept him away. He made a little mistake, to be sure, but it is to the credit of his modesty." Jane's praise of Bingley's modesty and good qualities was endless. Elizabeth was pleased to find that he had not revealed Darcy's interference, as Jane's generous heart might have been prejudiced against him. "I'm certainly the most fortunate creature that ever existed," cried Jane. "Oh, Lizzie, why am I thus singled out and blessed above all my family? If I could but see you as happy, if there were but such another man for you!" "If you were to give me 40 such men, I could never be as happy as you. Till I have your disposition, I can never have your happiness. No, no, let me shift for myself. Perhaps, with good luck, I may meet another Mr. Collins in time." The news of Jane's engagement soon spread through Meryton, and the Bennets were quickly deemed the luckiest family in the world, a sharp contrast to the misfortune that had marked Lydia's elopement just weeks earlier. Chapter 56. Uninvited Interference. One bright morning, about a week after Bingley and Jane's engagement was officially announced, the Bennet family was gathered in the dining room, enjoying the early sunshine filtering through the windows. Suddenly, the sound of an approaching carriage drew everyone's attention. They saw a grand chaise and 4 horses pulling up the lawn. It was an unusual sight, as the equipage didn't match any of their neighbours. Before anyone could speculate further, Bingley, always quick on his feet, suggested to Jane, "Why don't we take a walk in the shrubbery and leave the others to deal with this unexpected guest?" Jane agreed, and off they went, leaving Elizabeth, Mrs. Bennet, and Kitty to wonder who this mysterious visitor could be. The door swung open, and in walked Lady Catherine de Bourgh, with an air more imperious than usual. Mrs. Bennet, ever the hostess, was caught between astonishment and delight. "My lady, what an unexpected pleasure!" she exclaimed, curtsying deeply. Kitty and Elizabeth quickly followed suit, though Elizabeth's curtsy was more measured. Lady Catherine responded with a curt nod and barely acknowledged Elizabeth's greeting. Instead, she sat down without invitation, her stern gaze sweeping the room. Elizabeth introduced her mother, who was thrilled to be speaking to someone of such high rank. "Lady Catherine, may I offer you some refreshments?" Mrs. Bennet asked eagerly. Lady Catherine declined with a sharp, "No, thank you," and then turned to Elizabeth. "Miss Bennet, I noticed a small wilderness on one side of your lawn. Would you accompany me on a walk?" Mrs. Bennet, ever eager to please, urged, "Go, Lizzie, show her ladyship the grounds. I think she will enjoy the hermitage." Elizabeth grabbed her parasol and led Lady Catherine out, wondering all the while what on earth had brought her here. As they walked in silence along the gravel path, Elizabeth couldn't help but compare the lady's harsh demeanour with Mr. Darcy's more composed and courteous manner. Once they entered the copse, Lady Catherine stopped abruptly and turned to Elizabeth with a glare. "Miss Bennet, you must know why I am here. Your heart and conscience should tell you the reason." Elizabeth looked genuinely puzzled. "I'm afraid I don't, madam. I can't imagine what would bring you here." Lady Catherine's tone grew sharper. A report reached me that not only is your sister to be advantageously married, but that you, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, are to be united with my nephew, Mr. Darcy. I came here to put an end to such a scandalous rumour." Elizabeth's astonishment turned to indignation. "If you believed it to be false, why travel so far to confront me? What could you hope to achieve?" "To insist that such a report be publicly contradicted," Lady Catherine replied with a haughty air. Elizabeth's smile was calm, but her words were sharp. "Your visit to Longbourn will only confirm any such rumour if it exists, and if it doesn't, you've just given birth to it by being here." Lady Catherine's eyes blazed with anger. "Do you deny that my nephew has made you an offer?" "You have declared it impossible. Why ask me then?" Elizabeth retorted. "Because," Lady Catherine snapped, "you might have bewitched him into forgetting his duty and station." "If I had, I wouldn't admit it," Elizabeth said coolly. "Miss Bennet, I am his closest relative. I demand to know the truth. But you are not entitled to know mine, and I'll not be bullied into answering." Lady Catherine was livid. "You have the presumption to aspire to my nephew's hand? You, of such inferior birth?" Elizabeth stood her ground. "Mr. Darcy is a gentleman, and I am a gentleman's daughter. As equals, we may choose for ourselves." Lady Catherine scoffed. "You have no idea what you're up against. My daughter has been intended for Mr. Darcy since their infancy. Your alliance would disgrace him and his family." Elizabeth's patience was wearing thin. "If Mr. Darcy is neither bound by honour nor inclination to his cousin, he is free to choose his own wife. And if he chooses me, I shall accept." "Your alliance would be a disgrace," Lady Catherine declared. "You would be censured and despised by everyone connected with him." "That is a heavy misfortune," Elizabeth replied calmly. "But the happiness of being Mr. Darcy's wife would outweigh such concerns." Lady Catherine's face turned red with fury. "You are a headstrong, obstinate girl. Do you refuse to promise that you will not marry him?" "I will make no such promise," Elizabeth said firmly. "I will act as I see fit." Lady Catherine was beside herself with rage. "You will ruin him and disgrace yourself." "I see no disgrace in marrying a man I respect and admire," Elizabeth answered, her voice steady. Lady Catherine turned on her heel. "I take no leave of you, Miss Bennet. I am most seriously displeased." Elizabeth watched her go, feeling a mix of relief and triumph. She returned to the house where her mother met her eagerly at the door. "Why did Lady Catherine leave so abruptly?" Mrs. Bennet asked. "She had urgent matters to attend to," Elizabeth replied, not wanting to divulge the true nature of their conversation. Mrs. Bennet sighed. "Such a fine lady, calling on us. I suppose she just wanted to check on the Collinses. Did she say anything particular, Lizzie?" Elizabeth smiled faintly. "Nothing of importance, Mamma. Just checking in on old friends." As Elizabeth headed upstairs, she couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. She had stood her ground against Lady Catherine, and nothing could diminish the satisfaction of having done so. Chapter 57. Surprising Suspicions. Elizabeth's mind was in a whirl after Lady Catherine's unexpected visit. She couldn't shake off the sense of unease and curiosity that followed. The grand lady had made the journey all the way from Rosings to specifically demand that Elizabeth break off her supposed engagement with Mr. Darcy. The absurdity of it was enough to make Elizabeth's head spin. How could such a rumour have started? Then she remembered that Mr. Darcy was Bingley's close friend, and Jane was Bingley's love, which naturally led the neighbourhood gossips at Lucas Lodge to assume there might be another wedding on the horizon. Lady Catherine's fierce determination to prevent the match left Elizabeth uneasy. She worried that Lady Catherine might influence Mr. Darcy. Despite her disdain for the woman, she couldn't ignore the possibility that Darcy valued his aunt's opinion. The thought gnawed at her. What if Lady Catherine's arguments, ridiculous as they were to Elizabeth, held weight with Darcy? The rest of the family was equally astonished to hear about Lady Catherine's visit. Mrs. Bennet's curiosity was somewhat satisfied, though Elizabeth was spared from much of her prying. The next morning, as Elizabeth descended the stairs, her father emerged from his library holding a letter. "Lizzie," he called, "I was just about to look for you. Come into my study." Her curiosity piqued, she followed him to the fireplace where they both sat down. "I received a letter this morning that astonished me greatly. As it concerns you most, you ought to know its contents. I had no idea I had 2 daughters on the brink of matrimony. Let me congratulate you on a very important conquest." Elizabeth blushed furiously, convinced it must be a letter from Mr. Darcy. She wasn't sure whether to be pleased or offended that Darcy hadn't addressed her directly. But her father continued, "You look conscious. Young ladies have great penetration in such matters, but even you may not guess who your admirer is. This letter is from Mr. Collins." "Mr. Collins? What can he have to say?" she asked, astonished. "Something very much to the purpose. He begins with congratulations on Jane's upcoming nuptials, of which he was informed by the good-natured Lucases. But the part concerning you is as follows. Having thus offered you the sincere congratulations of Mrs. Collins and myself on this happy event, let me now add a short hint on the subject of another. Your daughter Elizabeth will not long bear the name of Bennet after her eldest sister has resigned it, and the chosen partner of her fate may be reasonably looked up to as one of the most illustrious personages in this land. Can you guess who he means, Lizzie? This young gentleman is blessed with splendid property, noble kindred, and extensive patronage. Yet, despite all these temptations, let me warn my cousin Elizabeth and yourself of the evils you may incur by a precipitate closure with this gentleman's proposals, which, of course, you will be inclined to take immediate advantage of. Have you any idea who this gentleman is? Now it comes out. My motive for cautioning you is this. We have reason to imagine that his aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, does not look on the match with a friendly eye. Mr. Darcy, you see, is the man. Now, Lizzie, I think I have surprised you." Elizabeth tried to join in her father's humour, but could only manage a weak smile. Never had his wit been so unwelcome. "Are you not entertained?" he asked. "Oh yes, please read on," she replied, barely masking her discomfort. After mentioning the likelihood of this marriage to her ladyship, she expressed her disapproval, citing family objections. "I felt it my duty to inform you, so that you and your noble admirer may be aware of what you are about and not rush into a marriage that has not been properly sanctioned." Mr. Collins adds, "I am truly rejoiced that my cousin Lydia's sad business has been so well hushed up. However, I am amazed that you received the young couple into your house as soon as they were married. It was an encouragement of vice. Had I been the rector of Longbourn, I would have opposed it strenuously. You should forgive them as a Christian, but never admit them into your sight again. That is his notion of Christian forgiveness. The rest of his letter is about his dear Charlotte's situation and the expectation of a young olive branch. But, Lizzie, you look as if you did not enjoy it. You are not going to be missish and pretend to be affronted by an idle report, are you? For what do we live but to make sport for our neighbours and laugh at them in our turn?" "Oh," cried Elizabeth, "I am exceedingly entertained, but it is so strange." "Yes, that is what makes it amusing. Had they fixed on any other man, it would have been nothing. But his perfect indifference and your pointed dislike make it delightfully absurd. Much as I dislike writing, I wouldn't give up Mr. Collins's correspondence for anything. Nay, when I read a letter of his, I can't help preferring him even over Wickham, much as I value the impudence and hypocrisy of my son-in-law. And pray, Lizzie, what did Lady Catherine say about this report? Did she call to refuse her consent?" Elizabeth laughed in reply, avoiding the need to answer directly. Her father's lack of penetration and her own fear that she might have misread Mr. Darcy's feelings left her feeling more vulnerable than ever. She had to laugh when she would rather have cried. Her father's remarks about Mr. Darcy's indifference had cruelly wounded her, and she could do nothing but wonder at his blindness, or fear that she had imagined too much. Chapter 58. A New Beginning. Just days after Lady Catherine's unexpected visit, Bingley and Darcy arrived at Longbourn. Their early morning appearance caught everyone by surprise. Before Mrs. Bennet could even mention Lady Catherine's visit, Bingley suggested a walk. Mrs. Bennet wasn't one for long strolls, and Mary had her nose buried in a book, so it was just Jane, Elizabeth, Kitty, and the two gentlemen. As they walked, Bingley and Jane soon lagged behind, allowing Elizabeth, Kitty, and Darcy to walk ahead. Kitty, intimidated by Darcy's presence, remained silent. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was gathering her courage for a conversation she knew was long overdue. Kitty soon excused herself to visit a friend, leaving Elizabeth and Darcy alone. Elizabeth took a deep breath and spoke with determination. "Mr. Darcy, I need to thank you for your extraordinary kindness to my sister. I've been eager to express my gratitude for everything you've done." Darcy looked genuinely surprised and touched. "I'm sorry you had to learn about it in a way that caused you distress. I didn't think Mrs. Gardiner would share those details." "It wasn't my aunt," Elizabeth said quickly. "Lydia's carelessness let it slip, and I couldn't rest until I knew everything. Your efforts to help my family have not gone unnoticed." Darcy replied earnestly, "If you must thank me, let it be for your sake alone. The happiness of knowing you might be pleased by my actions was enough to drive me." Elizabeth blushed and struggled to find her words. Darcy took a deep breath and continued, "You're too kind to toy with my emotions. If your feelings are still as they were in April, tell me now. My feelings haven't changed, but one word from you will silence me forever on this subject." Elizabeth, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement, finally said, "My sentiments have changed so much since then that I would be grateful and happy to accept your feelings." Darcy's face lit up with joy. He spoke passionately about his love for her, and Elizabeth listened, her heart swelling with happiness. They walked without paying attention to their direction, completely absorbed in their conversation. Darcy explained how Lady Catherine's visit had actually given him hope. "When my aunt told me about her conversation with you, I realized that if you were truly against me, you would have told her so openly." Elizabeth laughed. "Yes, you know me well enough to believe I would have been blunt." Darcy smiled warmly. "Your frankness has always been one of the things I admire most about you. My behavior that evening was inexcusable, and your criticism was well-deserved. It's something I've reflected on deeply." They continued their walk, discussing their past misunderstandings and how they had grown from them. Darcy admitted, "Your words that night changed me. They made me realize how much I needed to improve." Elizabeth confessed, "I never expected my words to have such an impact. I'm glad they did, though." They walked for miles, losing track of time, until they finally noticed it was getting late. "I wonder what happened to Jane and Mr. Bingley," Elizabeth said, smiling. Darcy chuckled. "Bingley informed me about their engagement as soon as it happened. I wasn't surprised. I knew it would happen soon." Elizabeth teased. "So you gave your permission?" Darcy laughed. "In a way, yes. I told him about my previous interference and assured him that your sister was not indifferent to him. It was enough to give him the confidence he needed." Elizabeth smiled warmly, appreciating how Darcy had helped his friend. They reached Longbourn, and as they entered the hall, they knew their lives were forever changed. Mrs. Bennet's joy knew no bounds when she learned of Darcy's proposal. "Oh, Lizzie, you'll be the mistress of Pemberley. What a grand match!" Elizabeth blushed but felt a warmth in her heart, knowing that she had found a partner who truly understood and loved her. The journey they had taken to reach this point made their bond even stronger. In the days that followed, the household buzzed with excitement and preparations. The news spread quickly, and soon everyone was talking about the upcoming weddings. There was laughter, love, and a sense of community that filled the Bennet home. As Elizabeth and Darcy prepared for their future together, they knew that their journey had just begun. They looked forward to a life filled with love, family, and new adventures, knowing that they had found something truly special in each other. Chapter 59, Love and Laughter in Longbourn. "My dear Lizzie, where have you been wandering off to?" Jane asked, her gentle voice filled with curiosity as Elizabeth stepped into the cosy family room. The rest of the family joined in, each casting curious glances her way as they settled at the dinner table. Elizabeth, cheeks flushing with a slight embarrassment, replied, "We just wandered about until I lost track of where we were." Despite her reddened cheeks, her response raised no suspicions. The evening unfolded quietly, with the engaged couples laughing and chatting, while the unspoken emotions between Elizabeth and Darcy created a charged silence. Elizabeth was acutely aware of the storm of emotions she would soon unleash upon her family. She knew Jane was the only one who had ever seen the good in Darcy, but how would the others react? Her heart fluttered with a mix of anticipation and dread. Later that night, Elizabeth confided in Jane. Despite her usual tendency to believe the best of everyone, Jane was incredulous. "You're joking, Lizzie. Engaged to Mr. Darcy? No, I can't believe it. You must be pulling my leg," Jane exclaimed, eyes wide with disbelief. Elizabeth sighed. "This is not the reaction I was hoping for, Jane. If you don't believe me, who will? But it's true. He loves me, and we are engaged." Jane looked at her sister, still doubting. "Oh, Lizzie, you dislike him so much. How can this be real?" "You don't know everything, Jane. I may not have always loved him as I do now, but that's all in the past. It's a memory I plan to forget, starting now." Jane's astonishment lingered. Elizabeth, with more earnestness, reassured her of the truth. "Good heavens! I must believe you now," Jane cried. "My dear Lizzie, I'm so happy for you, but are you sure you can be happy with him?" "There's no doubt, Jane. We're going to be the happiest couple in the world. Are you pleased? Will you welcome him as a brother?" "Very much so. Bingley and I will be delighted, but we thought it impossible." "Do you truly love him?" "Oh, yes, perhaps even more than I ought. But Jane, please be happy for me." Jane hugged her sister tightly. "You sly thing! How little you told me about what happened at Pemberley and Lambton. But I forgive you. Now tell me everything." Elizabeth explained her secrecy, and they spent half the night talking, laughing, and planning. The next morning, Mrs. Bennet was at the window when she spotted Darcy arriving with Bingley. "If that disagreeable Mr. Darcy isn't here again. Lizzie, you must walk with him to keep him from bothering Bingley." Elizabeth stifled a laugh at her mother's words, but was genuinely annoyed by her repeated criticism. When the gentleman arrived, Bingley's warm handshake and expressive look left no doubt that he was in the know. "Mrs. Bennet, have you no more lanes where Lizzie might lose her way again today?" Bingley teased, his eyes twinkling. Mrs. Bennet suggested Mr. Darcy, Lizzie and Kitty should walk to Oakham Mount. "It's a lovely long walk, and Mr. Darcy hasn't seen the view." "It might be too much for Kitty," Bingley replied. Kitty quickly agreed, preferring to stay home. Darcy expressed interest in the walk, and Elizabeth silently consented. Mrs. Bennet followed Elizabeth upstairs, whispering, "I'm sorry you have to entertain him, but it's for Jane's sake. Just talk to him now and then." During their walk, Elizabeth and Darcy decided to seek Mr. Bennet's approval that evening, with Elizabeth reserving the task of informing her mother. The evening brought Darcy and Mr. Bennet's conversation in the library, leaving Elizabeth anxious. When Darcy re-emerged with a reassuring smile, she felt slightly relieved. Soon, he whispered to her, "Your father wants to see you in the library." Elizabeth entered to find her father pacing. "Lizzie, what are you thinking? Are you out of your mind accepting this man? Didn't you always hate him?" Elizabeth wished her past opinions had been more tempered. She assured him of her affection for Darcy, though her words came with difficulty. "Or, in other words, you're determined to have him because he's rich. But will wealth make you happy?" Mr. Bennet asked. "Do you have any objection other than my supposed indifference?" Elizabeth asked, tears in her eyes. "I love him, and he is not the proud man you think." "Very well, Lizzie," her father finally said. "If you truly love him, I give my consent. But remember, you must esteem your husband. Your lively spirit requires a partner you can respect." Elizabeth, deeply moved, explained how her feelings had evolved, and Mr. Bennet, impressed by her sincerity, finally gave his full support. After telling him about Darcy's role in Lydia's marriage, Mr. Bennet was astonished. Darcy did all this. Well, that saves me a lot of trouble and money. I'll offer to repay him, but I doubt he'll accept." Relieved, Elizabeth joined the family with renewed composure. She shared the news with her mother, whose reaction was nothing short of extraordinary. "Mr. Darcy, who would have thought it? Oh, Lizzie, how rich and great you'll be. Jewels, carriages. Jane's marriage is nothing compared to this. I'm so happy," Mrs. Bennet gushed, unable to contain her excitement. Elizabeth, thankful that only she heard her mother's outburst, went to her room, but Mrs. Bennet soon followed, babbling about Darcy's wealth and their future. "A special licence, and tell me, what dish does Mr. Darcy like best? I must prepare it tomorrow." The next day went better than Elizabeth expected. Mrs. Bennet, in awe of Darcy, spoke to him only to offer courtesies, and Mr. Bennet made an effort to get to know him. "I admire all my sons-in-law," Mr. Bennet declared. "Wickham might be my favourite scoundrel, but I think I'll like your Mr. Darcy just as much as Bingley." And so, amidst humour, love, and family values, Elizabeth's and Darcy's union was embraced, bringing a sense of warmth and completion to Longbourn. Chapter 60. A Love to Remember. Elizabeth's spirits quickly bounced back to their playful self, and she couldn't help but tease Mr. Darcy about how he ever managed to fall in love with her. "Tell me, Mr. Darcy," she began with a mischievous glint in her eye, "how on earth did you even start to fall for me? I can understand how you continued to be charmed, but what sparked it?" Darcy smiled, a warmth in his eyes that softened his usual serious demeanour. "I cannot pinpoint the exact moment, the place, or even the words that began it all. It just happened, gradually, and then, all at once." Elizabeth laughed, shaking her head. "You resisted my beauty quite well, and my manners were nothing short of uncivil toward you. Admit it, you admired me for my impertinence." Darcy chuckled. "For the liveliness of your mind, yes." "You mean my cheekiness?" she exclaimed. "You were tired of all the women who fawned over you, trying to win your favour. I caught your attention because I was the complete opposite. If you weren't so genuinely good, you would have hated me for it. But your noble and just heart saw through all that." He grinned, a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. "You've made it quite easy for me. I must admit, there was something incredibly refreshing about your honesty and straightforwardness." Elizabeth's laughter was like music, filling the air around them. "Let's be honest. You knew nothing good about me at first, but love doesn't always need a reason, does it?" Darcy's expression turned tender. "Was there no good in your caring behaviour toward Jane when she was ill at Netherfield?" "Oh, dearest Jane, anyone would have done the same for her. But go ahead, make a virtue of it if you must. You're supposed to exaggerate my good qualities, and I'll find ways to tease and quarrel with you as often as possible. Speaking of which, why were you so reluctant to approach me when you first visited and dined here?" Darcy sighed, a look of embarrassment crossing his face. "Because you were grave and silent, giving me no encouragement." Elizabeth's eyes sparkled with mischief. "But I was embarrassed." "And so was I," Darcy admitted. "You could have talked to me more during dinner." "A man who felt less might have," Darcy replied. Elizabeth laughed again. "How lucky you have a reasonable answer for everything. I wonder how long you would have kept silent if I hadn't mentioned Lydia and thanked you. That breach of propriety had a huge effect. Too much, perhaps. But then, Lady Catherine's interference helped a lot, didn't it?" Darcy's smile grew. "Indeed, Lady Catherine's attempts to separate us only made me more determined. Her visit to you made me hope that you hadn't completely decided against me." Elizabeth nodded. "Her visit did the opposite of what she intended. But what brought you to Netherfield? Was it just to be embarrassed or something more serious?" Darcy looked at her earnestly. "I came to see you and to judge if I had any hope of making you love me. My other reason was to see if your sister still cared for Bingley, and, if so, to encourage him." Elizabeth's heart swelled with affection. "Will you have the courage to tell Lady Catherine?" "I will find the time, Elizabeth," Darcy said, with a determined nod. and if you give me some paper, I'll write to her immediately." Elizabeth smiled, thinking of her own letter to write. "I have an aunt who deserves a long overdue response." She sat down to pen a letter to her Aunt Gardiner, filled with joy and love, finally able to share her happiness. "My dearest aunt, I must apologize for my delay in writing. You supposed more than was true, but now you can let your imagination run wild. I am the happiest creature in the world. Mr. Darcy and I are to be married, and I cannot wait for you to visit Pemberley at Christmas. Yours affectionately, Elizabeth." Meanwhile, Darcy wrote his letter to Lady Catherine with a mix of resolve and courtesy. Mr. Bennet, too, had a letter to write. "Dear Sir, I must trouble you once more for congratulations. Elizabeth will soon be the wife of Mr. Darcy. Console Lady Catherine as best you can, but I suggest standing by the nephew. He has more to offer. Yours sincerely." The Bennet household buzzed with excitement. Jane and Bingley were beaming with happiness, and Elizabeth's own joy was unparalleled. Miss Darcy's heartfelt congratulations added to the elation, while Miss Bingley's insincere congratulations were politely received. The unexpected arrival of the Collinses at Lucas Lodge brought mixed feelings. Charlotte was delighted by Elizabeth's match, seeking refuge from Lady Catherine's wrath. Darcy endured Mr. Collins's obsequiousness with remarkable patience, even managing a polite smile at Sir William's compliments. Elizabeth did her best to shield Darcy from the more vulgar elements of her family. Despite the discomfort, the season of courtship was filled with hope for a future where they could escape to the comfort and elegance of Pemberley. As the wedding day approached, Elizabeth and Darcy's love grew stronger, surrounded by the warmth of family and friends. The promise of a new beginning filled their hearts with joy, knowing that their love story was just beginning. Chapter 61. A Mother's Joy and New Beginnings. The day Mrs. Bennet saw both of her most deserving daughters married was one of unparalleled joy. Her delighted pride shone brightly as she visited Mrs. Bingley and talked endlessly of Mrs. Darcy. If only this double success had made her a more sensible, amiable and well-informed woman. But alas, she remained occasionally nervous and invariably silly. It might have been a blessing in disguise for Mr. Bennet, who perhaps wouldn't have enjoyed such domestic felicity in an unusual form. Mr. Bennet, however, missed his second daughter immensely. His affection for Elizabeth drew him out of Longbourn more frequently than anything else ever could, and he took great pleasure in making unexpected visits to Pemberley. Mr. Bingley and Jane stayed at Netherfield for only a year. Even Bingley's easygoing nature and Jane's affectionate heart found the proximity to Mrs. Bennet and the Meryton relations a bit too close for comfort. To the delight of Bingley's sisters, he bought an estate in a neighbouring county to Derbyshire, allowing Jane and Elizabeth the joy of being within 30 miles of each other. Kitty benefited greatly from spending most of her time with her two elder sisters. Being in such superior company helped her improve in countless ways. Unlike Lydia, Kitty was not as uncontrollable, and away from Lydia's influence, she became less irritable, less ignorant, and far more agreeable. Although Mrs. Wickham frequently invited her to stay with promises of balls and young men, Mr. Bennet never consented to her going. Mary was the only daughter who remained at home. With Mrs. Bennet unable to sit alone, Mary was drawn away from her solitary pursuits and into more social situations. Though she could still moralize over every morning visit, she seemed to adjust to the change without much reluctance, as her father suspected. As for Wickham and Lydia, their characters remained unchanged despite their sisters' marriages. Wickham bore the knowledge that Elizabeth now knew all about his past with surprising calmness, and despite everything, he still harboured hopes that Darcy might somehow make his fortune. This hope was evident in a congratulatory letter Lydia sent to Elizabeth, which went something like this. "My dear Lizzie, I wish you joy. If you love Mr. Darcy half as much as I love my dear Wickham, you must be very happy. It is comforting to have you so rich, and when you have nothing else to do, I hope you will think of us. I am sure Wickham would like a place at court very much, and I do not think we shall have quite enough money to live upon without some help. Any place with an income of about 300 or 400 a year would do. However, do not speak to Mr. Darcy about it if you would rather not. Yours, etc. Elizabeth, much preferring not to mention it to Darcy, replied in a way that discouraged any further requests for assistance. However, she did practice economy in her own expenses to send them whatever relief she could manage. She knew their income, managed by two extravagant and heedless individuals, would never suffice. Jane or herself were often called upon to help settle their bills whenever they changed residences in search of a cheaper situation. Wickham's affection for Lydia quickly dwindled to indifference, while Lydia's lasted a bit longer. Despite her youth and manners, she retained the respectability her marriage provided. Though Darcy never welcomed Wickham at Pemberley, he supported him further in his profession for Elizabeth's sake. Lydia visited Pemberley occasionally when her husband went off to London or Bath, and both frequently stayed with the Bingleys until even Bingley's good humour wore thin, leading him to hint they should leave. Miss Bingley was deeply mortified by Darcy's marriage, but to retain her right to visit Pemberley, she dropped her resentment and was more attentive to Georgiana and Elizabeth than ever before. Pemberley became Georgiana's true home, and the bond between the sisters was as strong as Darcy had hoped. Georgiana admired Elizabeth greatly, even though Elizabeth's playful manner of speaking to Darcy initially shocked her. Over time, she learned from Elizabeth that a wife might take liberties with her husband that a sister would not. Lady Catherine was exceedingly indignant about her nephew's marriage. She expressed her displeasure in a letter so abusive, particularly towards Elizabeth, that all communication ceased for a while. Eventually, Elizabeth persuaded Darcy to seek reconciliation. Lady Catherine's affection for her nephew, or her curiosity about Elizabeth's conduct, led her to visit Pemberley, despite her disdain for Elizabeth's connections. The Gardiners remained close to Elizabeth and Darcy, who both cherished and felt deeply grateful to them. Their visit to Derbyshire had been instrumental in bringing Elizabeth and Darcy together, and they often reflected on this with heartfelt gratitude. As Elizabeth and Darcy settled into their new life, they were surrounded by family, friends, and a sense of community that brought them immense joy. Their story, filled with humour, romance, and enduring family values, was just beginning.
Thank you for listening to Pride and Prejudice Reimagined. We hope you have enjoyed this audiobook. If so, please like, share, or comment. By doing so, you can help others find this channel, and it will help us grow our community. Also, let us know in the comments what classic books you would like to hear reimagined through the lens of your favorite modern author, and we will try to make it happen soon.